Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is 11th of August and today we're going to be doing a full front update. Let's begin by looking at Kupyansk. In this region, the Russians are continuing their advance towards Sinkivka, so I'm going to clarify the situation over there. You have elements of the 6th Combined Arms Army, specifically the 25th and 138th Motor Rifle Brigades. Those are the two units that are really at the vanguard of this attack, that are really pushing forward along the Kupyansk front. And part of them are assaulting towards Sinkivka. And the situation in Sinkivka has really deteriorated for the Ukrainians over the past few days. The Russians, they are still not taking the town entirely, but they are pushing from Liman Pershi, and they've been able to take over multiple different strongholds in the forests north of Sinkivka, and even closer to Sinkivka around some of the fields. There are different strongholds and observation posts that are under Russian control now, that the Ukrainians either controlled or it was in a gray zone, and now the Russians are in that area. Now, just in terms of clarification of the map, I do have the forested area to the west of Liman Pershi marked under Ukrainian control for now. So that was a mistake. I had it under Russian control previously, but it seems as if the Ukrainian DRG units and some of their forward positions are still located in this forest. So for the Russians to continue to advance towards Kupyansk, they will need to clear out these forested areas. And at the same time, they are also advancing towards Sinkivka. Sinkivka at the moment, I'm saying, is contested. A lot of it is a gray zone. The Ukrainians do still hold part of the town, especially now that they moved in reinforcements from the 95th Air Assault Brigade. A lot of those men, they are being sent to Sinkivka specifically to hold the line for as long as possible. But the problem is a lot of the troops going back and forth. The reinforcements are going into Sinkivka for the Ukrainians, and some of the forces that are being rotated out, trying to be moved out towards Kupyansk. A lot of them are suffering from very heavy shelling from the Russians, and this is leading to very high casualties in Sinkivka specifically. So we're going to have to see how long the Ukrainians can hold the line over there before the Russians actually end up taking all of it. But for now, the Russians are in the northern outskirts of Sinkivka and just continue pushing, just as they're doing to the south of Vilshana. They have not stopped their attacks over here. The Russians continue attacking on a pretty broad front, maybe like 6, 7, 8 kilometers wide front, advancing a couple of 100 meters every single day now. And they've been able to take over the past few days multiple different strong points. They captured, I believe, 5 strongholds and 4 observation posts in these open fields, which would be around this area over here. And all of that's important on a local level, because you need to secure those in order to continue advancing through the fields to flank a town like Petropavlivka or Kucharivka or Podoli. And that's what we're seeing the Russians doing. This is the second axis of the Russian attack. The first axis is towards Sinkivka, of course, and that would reach directly into the north of Kupyansk. The second one is from Vilshana towards the ridge that is overlooking Kupyansk, which would also flank the town from the east. And we are continuing to see Russian advances in that direction, despite the fact that the Ukrainians have been moving in reinforcements and actually trying to launch counterattacks of their own. The reason why they're launching counterattacks in this area is probably in order to hold the line for as long as possible, in order to allow for Ukrainians to either evacuate certain positions or to better fortify the positions that they do want to hold on to that are closer to a town like Kupyansk. So what we're seeing now is that the 67th and 14th Brigades of the Ukrainian forces, so I have those marked over here, or that's 103rd TDF. Here's 67th Mechanized Brigade. 14th is this one, I believe. Yeah. So these two, they're conducting counterattacks around the Vilshana area, or at least attempting to. But so far, all of those have been repelled. So they're acting as a vanguard as the Ukrainians continue to send reinforcements. And this is something that has been reported on, that Alexander Syrskyi, he's a commander of the Ukrainian ground forces for the war. He is requesting that Zelensky move in reserves to this area. And so this is, even if the Russians don't actually succeed with whatever you believe they're trying to achieve in this area, I've laid out that I think that they're trying to shape the battlefield in a way that would allow them to take Kupyansk, maybe not now, but at least in the future. Even if that doesn't happen, the fact that Russia is attacking at this level and is forcing Ukraine to move reserves away from other parts of the front line, like Zaporozhye or from Bakhmut, and moving it towards Kupyansk, that is important, and it is slowing down the Ukrainian efforts at the very least. So the Russians, they were able to find this weak point on the front line, because really this area where the Russians are attacking on, there are not many Ukrainian men over here. Even with the reinforcements from the 95th, it's still a very small number of forces in comparison to Zaporozhye or Bakhmut, or really anywhere else. Maybe it's equivalent to Kherson or a bit more. But either way, this is a lightly defended area and it's a very broad front. And the Russians, they have been moving in forces. There's disputes as to whether it's 100,000. I've made a tweet, this very long tweet where I broke down all the forces and I said that it was closer to 70,000 on the sector. But regardless, it's a large amount of forces. Most of them have not been committed yet to the fighting. We only mentioned 2 brigades from one combined arms army that has been fighting on the front line. And so the Russians do still have a lot of forces that they can commit to this offensive. If it's an offensive, then they can commit it now or they can commit it in the future when they actually do want to go directly for Kupyansk. Because what we're hearing from Siersky, what he's saying is that this Russian offensive is aimed at going towards Kupyansk. That's his own words. But at the same time, the Russians are also attacking towards the town of Kislivka and Kotlyarivka. Now, the attacks here are more positional in nature. They're not really head-on attacks, you could say. They're actually going on more on the flanks of the towns. So, like, the Russian advance started around Yahidne, and they advanced about a kilometer or 1.5 kilometers to the north of Kislivka. And now you can see how they're in a position to flank the town. They're very close to Ivanivka, for instance, and they're also very, very close to the train station in Kislivka. They've also advanced from the rail line to some open fields, about 600 meters to in the area to the south of Kotlyarivka. And this will allow them to basically create this pincer where they're trying to encircle this cluster of Ukrainian towns, cluster of 4 Ukrainian towns that are on the front line. And they're very important for holding on to the front line because after these 4 towns, there's not really any other towns that are on the Oskar bridgehead for another 10 kilometers until you reach the areas adjacent to the river itself. So this is important for holding the front line. And the Russian attacks here are more positional in nature, but you see they still are making gains just because the Russians are able to overwhelm the Ukrainians over here. So now, in response to everything that I'm talking about, the Ukrainians, they are going through with some very significant measures. So the head of the Kupyansk military district, he announced the mandatory evacuation of civilians from 53 settlements that are in the Kupyansk rayon, that's the region within Kharkiv, that a lot of the fighting is going on in a region that has Kupyansk not inside of it, because the city of Kupyansk is on Kupyansk rayon. It's its own subdivision, I believe. But all of the towns around it, they're experiencing very heavy shelling, and they are very close to the front line. And what I believe is that as the Ukrainians begin to move reinforcements into this area, they want to free up space, and they don't want to deal with the issues with civilians being next to the front line in such a heavy battle. So it is just easier for the civilians, obviously, but also for the military to not have any civilians in the way as the fighting is going on. So you could see here, I have this white polygon which shows the area that is being evacuated. Civilians will be forced to evacuate, and that includes 11,000 civilians and 600 children within that area. And so we're going to have to see if this measure and additionally the reinforcements that Ukraine is probably going to send, which I'll adjust the map to indicate, we'll have to see if that's enough to hold the line, or if Russia will continue their advances, taking Sinkivka and approaching the suburbs of Kupyansk. Now moving to the Bakhmut sector, we're going to look at Kurdyumivka quickly, because I believe it was 2 days ago when the Russians launched this counterattack to the north of Kurdyumivka. So previously the Ukrainians, they put a lot of pressure on the northern flank of Kurdyumivka and Zelenopilya, and there was this appearance that perhaps they'd end up taking the town because we didn't see a lot of Russian resistance. But now the Russians have went on the counterattack. They've been able to advance, let's see, 2 or maybe at most 3 kilometers in certain areas. And what this means is that, first of all, Kurdyumivka, a lot of the pressure on it's going to be relieved for the time being. Also, it means that the Russians now have forward positions that are very close to the fields that Ukraine took over a couple of weeks ago that overlook towns like Andriivka and overlook the town of Klishivka. Because, look, the Ukrainians, they have control of these heights over here that are pretty close to Andriivka, and that allows them to conduct attacks into Andriivka. It also allows them to conduct attacks towards Klishivka, and it gives them these firing positions that are overlooking the Russian positions in Klishivka. So that's why these fields are important. Now the Russians are very close to these fields and could potentially push them out, because you see that the Ukrainians are in a bit of a bulge where they're exposed, because the Russians are pushing in this direction, and then the Russians already have a presence in the northern part of Klishivka. You can see how this pincer would formulate. So I don't know if the Russians are going to go for that, but it does present a new opportunity for them. And what we're seeing now is we had this geolocated footage of Ukrainians shelling Russian reconnaissance units north of Kurdyivka, which confirms the extent of the Russian gains in this area, taking over different fields and different strong points, different hedgerows in the area. And at the same time, as Russia is advancing to the south, a bit to the north, the Ukrainians are also advancing. They're continuing to clear out the forested areas to the north of Klishchivka. And I'll show the area where most of this fighting is going on. It's going on within these two rectangles, you could say. There's this forest that spans from the north of Klishchivka all the way into Bakhmut from the south, and it also runs adjacent to the rail line, which is a rail line that the Russians are using for defensive positions. And the Ukrainians want to take it over in order to flank the defensive lines of the Russians in this area and catch them by surprise, and also to reach the southern outskirts of Bakhmut. So now we've seen the Ukrainians over the past few days advance not much, maybe you could say a couple of 100 meters throughout this entire area, and they are making very steady gains. But let's go to the south now. We're going to focus on the situation around Urozhaine, which is very interesting. So in our last video, we talked about how the Ukrainians successfully pushed out the Russians from the northern outskirts of Urozhaine, and that was done directly from the north. It was not done by crossing over Stormayorsk. So this is the area that Ukraine was able to push the Russians out of, and they had some trenches prepared in that area. So the Russians, they were forced to fall back deeper into the town. You could say to like this area probably. And then by the end of August 10th, which was yesterday, you had the 37th Marine Brigade, which is one of these units on the front line. I'm going to find it over here. The 37th Marine Brigade was able to launch a new attack and actually take control over those outskirts. Because when the Ukrainians initially pushed the Russians out, they were not able to fortify those positions and maintain a permanent settlement there. But the day later, on the 10th of August, the 37th Marine Brigade was able to do that. And then they planned to fully push out the Russians from Urozhaine, because the Russians, they have a fallback line. And that line probably is about here. So the 37th Brigade, they got all of these attachments together and they launched this artillery preparation, and then they sent their men to attack the front line, but that attack was repulsed. And so the Russians still hold on to the center of Urozhaine, to the southern half of it, and most of the northern half is a gray zone, with the Ukrainians still having positions in the northern outskirts. So now, because this area over here that I'll mark in blue is a gray zone, this makes it easier for the Ukrainians to cross over the river than it was before. They can cross over throughout this entire area over here and take control over it, and they won't really have to worry about Russian forces attacking them. They would worry about shelling, of course, but it is easier than it was before, because previously the Russians had a firm control over this area. Now they're going to be able to send forces across the river from Stormayorsk to Urozhaine, and then you'll have this combined force that's attacking directly towards the town itself. But what this means is that Urozhaine will not be encircled. The Russians will just be squeezed out at some point based on what we're seeing. Now, the final part of the front line that I'll talk about is Robotyne. This area is very interesting because I've been forced to make some changes to the map that I was not expecting. So now it seems as if the Ukrainians do have a presence in the northern outskirts of Robotyne. In the last video, we talked about how the Russians were able to keep 100% control over the town, but now it seems that has changed. The Ukrainians have probably some sort of foothold in the northern outskirts around some of these abandoned houses where neither side previously had control over. The main Russian heart of the town that is under their control is in the center. And that's also the area where RIA Novosti showed their drone footage of the town that was still under Russian control. They weren't showing the northern outskirts. That area was probably a gray zone at the time. But now you have units from the Scala Intelligence Battalion, I believe that's what it's called. And there was a Wall Street Journal article that talked about their operations in this area. It was released yesterday. And it talked about how they were able to secure a foothold in the northern part of the town. Now, the thing about these articles is it takes a while for them to be published, so it could be talking about an earlier incident. But we now have additional information that came out about an hour ago, which came from Ukrainian sources, but also from some Russian sources, talking about a new Ukrainian push into Robotyne and towards its eastern flank. So the Ukrainian side, they posted this video of this Ukrainian soldier, and his face was blanked out, obviously, but he was photoed in front of the sign that shows Robotyne. So that would show that there, at the very least, are the roads leading into the town. And then there was another video that was released on the outskirts of Robotyne by the Ukrainians, showing some destroyed Russian equipment as they were walking towards the town itself. So we do know that there's a Ukrainian presence in the northern outskirts. Specifically where is hard to determine. But at the same time, the Ukrainians are launching a new attack on the eastern flank, which would be on about a 6 kilometer wide front, according to Russian sources that mention this Ukrainian attack. So it could potentially be this entire width, this entire area over here. So basically from the outskirts of Robotyne to the outskirts of Verbove. And the Ukrainians, they're pushing towards the fortifications that Russia has under their control on the eastern flank that they were not able to dislodge the Russians from in their last attack. And we do have some geolocated footage, which I'm marked over here, and it shows the Russians, specifically from the 70th Motor Rifle Regiment, shelling the Ukrainians. And so I might have to adjust the map to show that this part is a gray zone if the Ukrainians do have these columns of BMPs and tanks going through here. It doesn't seem likely that Russia has a fortified position in this area, in these fields over here. So it's even possible that this area is a gray zone over here, all of this. But we'll change that later. At the same time, the Ukrainians are also advancing towards Verbove, and you could see that this is their axis of attack, like this. They were able to advance yesterday about 1 or 2 kilometers in this area, so this is the extent of their gains. They have not reached the first defensive line in Verbove, but they have been able to retake some lost positions and some open fields. So we're going to have to see how this new Ukrainian attack materializes. If they're able to secure the trenches that are to the east of Robotyne, that will be very important as they also continue to push from the northern outskirts. Then you could see a two-pronged attack to push the Russians out of the town. And because the town is already pretty damaged, and there's also the possibility of Russians going to a fallback line, we'll have to see how the Russians respond, if they decide to hold the line or if they decide to move back to some other fortifications. But that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.